Imagine running a half marathon with a heavy backpack on your back across completely rough terrain. Your legs are throbbing with unbearable fatigue, and your shoulders refuse to move after hours of marching. Most people today would simply collapse onto the couch and sleep for days on end in such a situation. But if you were an ordinary Roman legionnaire, your real work was only just beginning. Every evening, regardless of the weather, fatigue, or the number of kilometers marched, the army built a fully fortified city. Defending your base against sudden raids is a classic trope, and anyone who has ever procrastinated playing games like Dota knows how quickly enemies can demolish unprotected structures. But Roman soldiers didn't have the option to hit pause, hide behind a monitor screen, or restart a failed level. They erected an impregnable fortress with their bare hands in a matter of hours before the onset of pitch darkness. Why did they expend so much precious energy instead of simply resting by a warm fire? Because sturdy walls meant a peaceful night's sleep and the physical survival of the entire massive army in the wild. It sounds like complete madness, especially when your muscles are already burning from the day's extreme exertion, but it was precisely this paradoxical strategy that made them the most invincible military machine of the ancient world. But here's where it gets really interesting, because the construction process wasn't just about chopping wood or digging the ground. It was a cold, mathematically precise algorithm that the army carried out on full autopilot day after day. Every movement was honed to perfection, and the slightest mistake could cost the lives of the entire legion of thousands. Now we'll see exactly how this city grew literally out of nothing in the middle of hostile territory. It all began long before the arrival of the main exhausted army, when special surveyors ventured far ahead. Their task was to find the perfect flat elevation, where access to fresh water and dense forest was a must. No one in their right mind wanted to set up camp in a damp swamp or haul water for thousands of people over several kilometers. Choosing the right location was a matter of survival, upon which the safety of the entire upcoming night's rest depended. As soon as the ideal spot was found, engineers would plant a conspicuous white flag right in the center of the future camp. This was not just a random rag on a stick, but the primary mathematical reference point for the entire grand construction project. From this simple flag, using ancient instruments, perfectly straight lines for future streets and residential districts were measured out. Construction did not begin with chaotic running about, but with precise geometric markings on the damp earth. Every soldier's tent, every deep trench, and every warehouse was assigned precise coordinates even before construction began. This allowed work to start immediately as soon as the troops, exhausted from their march, arrived at the designated site. The legionnaires did not have to stand in a crowd and wait for lengthy instructions from their exhausted commanders. They simply looked at the fluttering white flag, understood their position, and silently made their way to their workstations. Modern developers spend weeks on surveying the land for new residential complexes and neighborhoods. Roman engineers did this literally on the fly, often under conditions where the barbarians were already breathing down their necks. It sounds unbelievable, but this strict mathematical geometry saved thousands of lives every evening. Chaos on the construction site meant a loss of precious time, and lost time was always paid for with the blood of soldiers. Enemies regularly attempted to attack the legions precisely during the vulnerable moment of setting up the evening defensive camp. But the perfect preliminary layout completely deprived the attackers of their main advantage, the element of complete surprise. Every soldier knew in advance his maneuver and his defensive position on this vast invisible grid. This was a level of systematic organization absolutely unattainable by any other army of the ancient world. The choice of a high ground location was also never a matter of blind luck or happy coincidence. A steep hill provided excellent tactical visibility and critically complicated the ascent for any advancing enemy infantry. Water provided hydration for weary soldiers, and the nearby forest offered unlimited materials for fires and defensive barriers. This was the cold, pragmatic calculation of the commanders, leaving absolutely no room for foolish improvisation. Most barbarian tribes set up their temporary camps haphazardly, simply huddling together before sleep. They sincerely relied on their numerical superiority and natural fury in the event of a nighttime Roman attack. Roman generals, however, understood perfectly well that any fury quickly ends where banal fatigue begins. Therefore, they relied not on the emotions of the crowd, but on a strict mathematical system of collective survival. That very white flag at the geometric center of the camp was officially called the Praetorium in the Roman army. It was precisely at this spot that, a little later, the enormous command tent of the legion's commander-in-chief was erected. All the main roads of the camp converged like rays toward this center, ensuring ideal internal logistics and communication. It was literally a miniature Rome that moved on foot from one place to another every day. Ancient surveyors risked their lives greatly by venturing so far from the protective cover of the heavy infantry. They were usually accompanied only by a small detachment of elite cavalry for minimal protection against sudden ambushes in the forest. If these scouts were killed along the way, the entire legion of thousands could be left without organized lodging for the night. But this ancient system worked so flawlessly that fatal logistical failures were extremely rare. Imagine what it's like to watch from the bushes as a perfect city rises out of nowhere in the middle of a wild forest. To many unprepared barbarians, this process looked like terrifying magic or the direct intervention of powerful gods. In reality, it was simply hard, methodical physical labor and ingenious field military engineering. The Romans subdued the wild landscape much faster than the enemy even had time to realize it. Without exception, every Roman camp was built on an absolutely identical square or rectangular grid. Whether they were in the deserts of Africa or the cold forests of Britain, the plan remained the same. It was always a perfect geometric outline, as if stamped out across the entire vast empire. The only thing that varied was the final scale of the structure, depending on the number of legions present on the march. This strict standardization was based on an absolutely brilliant and pragmatic psychological calculation. Legionnaires, exhausted after the march, did not have to search for their place in the dark or ask for directions. Once inside the camp, every soldier could find his way around as easily as in his own home. The brain simply did not waste precious energy on making unnecessary decisions in the stressful evening environment. An ordinary soldier always knew exactly where his tent, the command headquarters, the hospital, and the food depots were located. Even the latrines and stables were situated in the exact same spots for decades on end. Imagine walking into any supermarket in the world and finding the items you need always on the same shelf. That is precisely the level of comfort and predictability the Roman engineering machine created for its people. Such total predictability completely eliminated panic and chaos during nighttime construction under the threat of attack. If an alarm sounded, the legionnaires could run to the designated assembly point with their eyes closed. In complete darkness, they moved instinctively, without bumping into other tents or carts carrying heavy weapons. This gave them a huge time advantage over enemies who often got lost in their own forest encampments. Even the medic's tent was always located in the quietest and most protected sector of this mobile city. Wounded soldiers did not have to be dragged across the entire camp through crowds of fighters marching to their positions. Doctors could work in peace, knowing that enemy arrows could not physically reach their remote section. This was a level of logistical care that modern armies only rediscovered in the 20th century. Many ancient armies suffered because commanders spent hours on the mundane task of assigning people to their places. While the leader was deciding where the elite unit would sleep and where the ordinary soldiers would sleep, precious evening hours were wasted. The Romans didn't waste a single second on this because the regulations were written once and for all. Their planning system was like a computer operating system that ran without the slightest glitch. But here is what is most interesting about this ideal symmetry of ancient military-urban planning. All these plans were not merely drawn on paper. They were drilled into the head of every recruit during training. A man could wake up in the middle of the night to the screams of barbarians and exactly 1 minute later, already be standing in perfect formation. He had no time to hesitate or feel fear because his body itself knew the correct route. Many historians are amazed at how much these camps resembled the empire's actual stone cities. They had their own central squares, where soldiers gathered for morning roll calls and orders from the generals. They had their own main avenues and secondary streets, laid out according to strict urban planning rules. They literally brought civilization on the soles of their sandals right into the heart of wild, unexplored lands. Enemy spies who managed to sneak inside often went mad at the sight. They expected to see a crowd of tired, dirty people, but instead they saw a perfectly functioning mechanism. This psychological effect crushed the will to resist even before any actual bloody conflict began. Geometry functioned as a psychological weapon, proving the superiority of the Roman mind over primitive chaos. That is precisely why the standard camp layout became one of the main symbols of the legion's invincibility. There was no room in it for individuality or the creative impulses of eccentric commanders. Instead, it offered a 100% guarantee that the army would survive yet another cold night. And for the sake of that guarantee, the Romans were prepared to reshape the landscape to their standards every evening. In the extreme conditions of enemy territory, the army never undertook earthworks with its entire force. That would have been pure suicide, since the barbarians often watched them from nearby bushes. Commanders understood perfectly well that an unarmed man with a shovel was an ideal and easy target for an ambush. Therefore, the Romans developed an ingenious system of division of labor that saved them from sudden annihilation. Exactly 1/3 of all the legionaries present remained in full combat gear and did not touch any tools. They formed a tight, impenetrable defensive line around the entire perimeter of the future large-scale construction site. These men stood with raised shields and loaded pylons, carefully scanning the darkening forest horizon. While their comrades toiled in the trenches, they provided an absolute safety net for the entire legion. The remaining 2/3 of the soldiers set aside their heavy metal armor entirely. They took up entrenching tools and began digging into the dry earth with incredible, animal-like speed. Their task was to dig as deep into the soil as possible before the defensive perimeter began to falter under the strain. It was a true race against time and the approaching darkness, with their own lives at stake. As soon as the first group of diggers ran out of steam, they were immediately replaced by fresh, rested troops. Modern top managers would call this process an ideal and effective rotation of the workforce on the production line. For the Romans, however, it was the only reliable way to avoid dying in the wild Germanic forest. This conveyor belt did not stop for a single second until the last stake was driven into the defensive wall. Such strict discipline required tremendous mutual trust among the ordinary legionnaires. A man in the trench completely entrusted his life to the guy standing with a shield above him. If the guard blinked or flinched at a flying spear, the digger would be killed on the spot right in the trench under construction. It was precisely this trust, forged through hard collective labor, that made the Roman formation so monolithic in battle. By comparison, most tribes simply dropped their gear and went to rest, leaving a couple of sentries behind. They had no system in which one half of the army literally sacrificed its rest for the sake of the other. Among the Romans, however, selfishness was punishable by death, because survival was a purely collective process. And this harsh fairness in the distribution of burdens worked better than any modern motivational speech. The centurion supervising the construction walked among the ranks with special sticks made of grapevine. These sticks were not for show, but for harshly punishing those who tried to shirk their digging duties. If a soldier slacked off, he would instantly receive a blow to the back because his laziness endangered the entire camp. There were no unions or complaints about harsh conditions here. There was only harsh military efficiency. It was precisely thanks to this approach that the camp grew before their eyes at a pace that was terrifying to the enemy. While the barbarians were trying to organize their men for an attack, the Romans were already finishing digging deep trenches. Their division of labor transformed a crowd of people into a single, well-coordinated unit with thousands of working hands. It was a triumph of organized logistics over the raw and unpredictable force of the wild. In the end, when the construction was finished, the exhausted diggers went to rest behind the completed defensive walls. And those who had stood guard went to enjoy a well-deserved dinner, knowing that their work had been done perfectly. Tomorrow they would switch roles and the former guards would take up heavy, dusty shovels. This ideal system of mutual support allowed the army to advance without critical losses from exhaustion. The foundation of any Roman camp's passive defense was always an artificial deep moat and a high earthen rampart. Without these two elements, the entire mathematical layout within the walls would have been meaningless. The soldiers methodically dug a classic V-shaped trench around the entire perimeter of the huge square. This shape was not chosen by chance, as its steep slopes prevented the enemy from easily climbing out. The legionnaires did not scatter the heavy excavated earth haphazardly, but carefully piled it on the inner side of the moat. From this damp soil, a high, incredibly dense defensive embankment took shape right before their eyes. It became a reliable and powerful foundation for the future wooden fortress wall of the camp. The engineers compacted this earth so tightly that it turned into something resembling solid monolithic stone. The result was a deadly double obstacle for any attacking enemy unit. The barbarians first had to descend into this deep V-shaped ditch under a hail of Roman javelins. And then once in the pit, they had to scramble up a slippery, sheer earthen wall. This completely slowed down the attack and deprived the infantry of its main advantage, the force of a frontal ramming charge. Modern armies still actively use this ingenious principle when constructing trench lines. The only difference is that today, giant excavators and heavy track vehicles are used for this purpose. But Roman soldiers did all of this entirely by hand, moving tons of earth every evening after their march. Their shovels were just as important a weapon for conquering the world as their famous short swords. The dimensions of this trench could vary greatly depending on the actual level of threat in the region. In relatively peaceful provinces, the trench might be only about a meter deep for basic protection. But if the legion was in the heart of hostile Gaul, the ditch could plunge as deep as 3 meters into the ground. The Romans never spared their physical strength when it came to ensuring a safe night's sleep. At the bottom of such deep ditches, additional unpleasant surprises often awaited uninvited guests. The diggers might leave sharpened wooden stakes there, which would pierce the shoes of enemies jumping down. In the darkness, the attackers couldn't see these stakes and would plunge onto them at full speed under their own weight. This turned a simple earthen pit into a veritable meat grinder, operating entirely without the legionnaires' involvement. Sounds crazy, right? People would dig until their hands bled, creating a landscape they would leave behind the very next morning. But this grueling daily labor incredibly toughened their bodies, turning their muscles into iron cables. The legion's doctors understood that such heavy, monotonous work built endurance better than any sword training. The shovel turned ordinary peasants into the true super soldiers of antiquity. For the barbarian tribes, overcoming such a double barrier at night seemed simply an impossible task. Horses refused to jump into the dark V-shaped ravine, and the infantry got bogged down on the slippery slopes of the fresh embankment. All their usual tactics of a swift, savage raid were shattered by the cold calculation of the Roman sappers. Once again, engineering triumphed over brute, yet utterly disorganized animal strength. By sunset, the vast territory was completely surrounded by this man-made double ring of defense. The exhausted soldiers could finally wipe the sweat from their brows, knowing that the first line of defense had been successfully completed. But the earthen rampart was merely the foundation for the next, even more impressive stage of construction. The time had come to transform a simple mound of earth into a truly impregnable wooden fortress. During a grueling march of many kilometers, every Roman soldier carried more than just his personal weapons. A pair of long wooden stakes was always securely tied to his enormous, overloaded backpack. This seems completely absurd, since dense forest was already abundant all around them. Why carry heavy logs on your back when you could simply cut them down at the future campsite? But these stakes, known as muralia saws, had a special shape with pointed ends on both sides. They were designed in the shape of a perfect hourglass to quickly lock together. Chopping such complex structures in the dark would have taken too long and been incredibly noisy for a covert camp. Therefore, the legionnaires carried the ready-made modules of the future wall right on their calloused shoulders. At the very top of the fresh earthen rampart, the soldiers drove these pre-prepared stakes firmly into the ground. Thanks to their unique tapered shape in the middle, the stakes interlocked tightly into a monolithic wooden structure. In just a few minutes, they formed a continuous, absolutely impenetrable wall around the entire camp. An impregnable palisade rose from nothing much faster than the enemy could even comprehend what was happening. It was a brilliant portable modular defense system that the army carried on their own aching backs. A wooden stake held together in this bundle was stronger than a modern heavy concrete block on a construction site. If the enemy tried to pull a single stake out of the ground, they had to drag the entire woven wall along with it. Pulling out a single element was physically impossible even for a group of the strongest barbarians. This portable wall had another hidden tactical advantage over ordinary logs. The sharpened upper ends of the stakes prevented attackers from easily jumping over or climbing the palisade. They functioned as an ancient analog of modern barbed wire, tearing flesh with any attempt to storm the defenses. The legionnaires could safely spear their enemies through the narrow gaps between the stakes while remaining completely safe. Modern special forces also frequently use modular portable shelters for rapid base deployment, but they transport them in heavy armored trucks rather than carrying them on foot for hundreds of kilometers. A Roman legionary was his own truck, crane, and assembler all rolled into one. Their endurance is mind-boggling since the weight of those two stakes added a hefty few kilograms to their gear. Imagine the surprise of an enemy scout who had just seen an empty hill with a lone flag. And within an hour, that hill was surrounded by a jagged wooden wall, bristling with sharp pylons. Such speed in erecting fortifications completely demoralized the enemy, robbing them of any hope of success. The Romans demonstrated that they controlled not only the battlefield, but also the very passage of time around it. Interestingly, soldiers could face severe punishment for every stake driven in crookedly or secured too loosely. Centurions personally tested the wall's strength by kicking it with all their might in their heavy, iron-shod sandals. If the palisade wobbled, the unit responsible was forced to rebuild the entire section from scratch in complete darkness. In Roman engineering, there was no room for the phrase "good enough," only absolute perfection. In the end, the portable palisade completed the creation of an impenetrable barrier between the weary army and the wild world. Now the legion was inside a secure shell that protected it from the nightmares of Gaul or Britain. They could finally take off their heavy, dusty helmets and begin setting up their living quarters. The city was protected from the outside. It was time to breathe real life into it from within the walls. While half the army dug the ground and drove in stakes, the others were actively setting up sleeping quarters. The Roman military tent, or contubernium, was a true engineering marvel made of thick tanned calf skin. Each 8-man squad set up its mobile home in a strictly designated spot on the grid. These men lived, ate, and slept together, forming the smallest but strongest unit of the vast legion. This heavy leather roof protected the legionnaires just as reliably as the thick fur of a street dog in a winter blizzard. The material was incredibly durable and completely waterproof, even during the longest British downpours. Inside, it was always dry and relatively warm, even though an icy storm might be raging outside. A good night's sleep in dry clothes ensured that tomorrow the soldier would be able to swing his heavy sword again. Between the neat rows of these tents, engineers deliberately left very wide and spacious gaps. This was done not for aesthetic reasons, but to prevent a catastrophic spread of fire throughout the camp. If the enemy fired flaming incendiary arrows from the woods, at most 1 or 2 leather tents would burn. The fire simply could not spread to neighboring dwellings due to the large artificial distance between them. Modern strict fire safety regulations in densely built-up cities operate on exactly the same principle. But ancient engineers implemented these life-saving standards millennia before the first fire inspectors appeared. They understood that a fire inside a dense wooden camp could cause more damage than an entire army of barbarians. Therefore, they isolated potential fire hazards during the mathematical planning of the streets. Leather tents were incredibly heavy, and carrying them on one's back during a march was simply impossible. Therefore, for their transport, each unit was assigned a special pack mule from the Legion's massive supply train. The mule carried the tent itself, heavy wooden stakes for it, and a hand mill for grinding the daily grain. If the animal died along the way, 8 soldiers had to carry all that weight on their own backs. There was critically little space inside the tent, and the legionnaires slept in cramped quarters, pressed tightly against one another. But on cold German nights, this closeness became their main salvation from frostbite while they slept. Body heat, trapped beneath a thick layer of calf skin, served as an excellent natural heater. Moreover, comrades were always nearby, ready to wake you at the first sounds of a nighttime alarm. Every morning, these tents were methodically taken down, tightly rolled into bundles, and loaded back onto the mules. This process, too, was timed down to the second so that the army could leave camp immediately after dawn. No fuss or lost pegs. Every soldier knew his task when packing up the communal shelter. The speed of packing was just as important as the speed of building fortifications the previous grueling evening. Interestingly, the tents of the centurions and generals were much larger and made of higher quality materials. But even they were subject to the general fire safety rules and were set up in strictly designated grid locations. The law of survival was the same for everyone, from a simple, beardless recruit to a celebrated legate in shining armor. Fire and enemy arrows made no distinction between military ranks in the nighttime chaos of battle. Once all the tents were set up, the camp finally took on the appearance of a real residential neighborhood. Smoke from hundreds of small fires rose into the sky, and the soldiers began to prepare their meager rations of wheat. At that moment, the illusion of a safe roam in the middle of a wild forest became as real and tangible as possible. But it was still too early to relax, for the internal communication routes had to be prepared. The main internal streets and avenues of the Roman camp were made incredibly wide for temporary encampment. Sometimes the distance from the edge of one tent to another reached a staggering 30 meters across. This was done absolutely not for aesthetic reasons or to create comfortable avenues for the soldiers' evening strolls. The width was vitally necessary for the instantaneous movement of huge masses of armed troops within the perimeter. In the event of a sudden nighttime alarm, thousands of legionnaires had to form battle lines right inside the camp. If the streets had been narrow, a deadly stampede, panic, and a complete loss of control over the troops would have ensued. But on the wide avenues, entire cohorts could line up in a perfect rectangle without getting in each other's way. A massive army could maneuver within its own walls just as freely as on an open training ground. These wide roads also served as an excellent buffer zone between the outer palisade and the sleeping quarters. Enemy flaming spears and arrows flying over the wall simply fell onto this wide, empty ground. They physically could not reach the tents with sleeping soldiers, losing their lethal force in flight. This was a perfect example of how competent urban architecture saved hundreds of lives passively. Imagine a modern city where roads are designed so that any emergency response vehicle can pass through them. The Romans thought in exactly the same terms, only instead of fire trucks, they had columns of heavy infantry. They needed to quickly move reserves from one end of the camp to the other if the enemy broke through the defenses. Wide, straight streets allowed them to do this at a run in a couple of minutes, without the risk of stumbling in the dark. The camp's main street, Via Principalis, cut right through the entire city and led to the main gate. It was along this street that the troops marched out to battle in the morning and returned with trophies in the evening. It was so level and well-trodden that mounted couriers could race along it at tremendous speed. No cart or abandoned barrel dared to block this critically important logistical artery. This open layout also played a huge role in maintaining basic sanitation for the massive crowd. Fresh air circulated freely between the rows of tents, carrying away smoke from campfires and unpleasant odors. Epidemics were far more terrifying to ancient armies than enemy swords, claiming thousands of lives in a matter of days. The ventilation of the streets helped reduce the risk of infection, spreading among this dense, marching crowd. Barbarians, accustomed to their cramped and tangled forest encampments, often got lost in this spacious camp. If they climbed over the wall, they expected to immediately find themselves in the thick of the enemy, but instead found themselves in an empty square. And from the other end of this 30-meter street, a bristling wall of shields advanced toward them in perfect formation. The Romans used the space as a trap where the enemy had not a single chance to maneuver. Many commanders of other armies were amazed at how much empty land the Romans enclosed with a defensive wall. It seemed to them an inefficient waste of the laborer's strength, who had to dig a longer trench. But Roman military strategy always looked several moves ahead, sacrificing the present for the sake of future maneuverability. Their camp was not merely a shelter, it was a gigantic staging ground for preparing a crushing counterattack. As a result, the wide streets turned the camp into a perfectly tuned machine for killing uninvited guests. Every meter of space worked toward victory, from the deep moat on the outside to the empty buffer zones on the inside. The legion was ready to repel any threat without leaving its zone of tactical comfort. But sometimes even such serious precautions were not enough against particularly cunning enemies. In particularly dangerous conditions, such as the wild forests of Germany, the Romans did not limit themselves to just a moat and a rampart. They understood perfectly well that superior enemy forces might attempt to take their fortress by a brazen mass assault. Therefore, in front of the main approaches to the camp, sappers prepared entire fields of deadly and completely invisible surprises. The engineering ingenuity of the legions transformed the very ground around the encampment into a cruel and merciless defensive weapon. The soldiers dug hundreds of small, deep pits, arranging them in a strict checkerboard pattern. At the very bottom of these wolf pits, wooden stakes, sharp as razors and scorched over a fire, were driven in tightly. From above, these diabolical traps were skillfully camouflaged with thin branches, dry grass, and a thin layer of local soil. They blended completely into the surrounding forest landscape, becoming invisible even in broad daylight. In the darkness of night, advancing enemy infantry or heavy cavalry would inevitably fall into these hidden pits. A foot would get caught in the trap, and the man with all his immense weight would impale himself on the wooden stake protruding from below. This was accompanied by blood-curdling screams that sowed panic among the ranks of disorganized barbarian warriors following behind. The attackers' battle formation collapsed hopelessly even before they reached the outer walls. The Roman legionaries possessed a dark sense of humor and affectionately called these gruesome traps lilies. They earned this name because of the pit's visual resemblance to a blooming flower with a deadly pistil protruding from its center. These flowers grew in dense fields in front of the most vulnerable sections of the defenses, turning the ground into a minefield. Modern infantry mines operate on exactly the same psychological logic of suppressing the enemy's will. There was another type of trap that the Romans cynically dubbed stimuli or inciters. These were thick wooden blocks with sharp iron hooks protruding from them in all directions. They were buried completely in the ground so that the hook barely rose above the surface, hidden by grass. When an enemy stepped on such a hook, it pierced the foot right through, pinning the person firmly to the spot. Imagine the horror of a barbarian commander who sends his best men on a nighttime assault against the camp. At first, his warriors fall by the hundreds into the lilies, breaking their legs and bleeding to death in the darkness. Those who break through further step on invisible traps and are left screaming in pain on the empty field. And from behind the palisade, a dense, deadly hail of heavy pilums and flaming arrows is already raining down on them. Of course, before the camp left this place, all these ingenious traps had to be neutralized. The Romans did not want friendly patrols or local peasants to accidentally fall into their own traps. The stakes were pulled from the ground and the pits were filled in tightly, restoring the landscape to its original, safe state. This was the Roman approach to the ecology of war. Kill effectively, but clean up the deadly debris. Many historians believe that it was Julius Caesar who brought the art of creating these traps to absolute perfection. During the famous siege of Alesia, his legions surrounded themselves with dozens of kilometers of such surprises. The Gauls outnumbered the Romans by nearly 5-1, but were unable to break through this field of death. Engineering proved once again that a commander's sharp mind trumps the brute physical force of a mob. As a result, the camp turned into a bristling hedgehog that was physically painful to even approach. It defended itself from a distance of tens of meters, giving the defenders a colossal tactical advantage in time. The soldiers could calmly dine by the campfires, listening as the night forest filled with the sounds of snares snapping. But the Romans' greatest achievement was not even the defense itself, but the incredible speed with which it was erected. The process of erecting an entire fortified city in the middle of the forest had been perfected by the legions to a state of absolute, terrifying automatism. The harshest military discipline and daily bloody drills did their job better than any modern motivational training. A fully functional, secure base for 5,000 armed men was built in just 3, at most 4 hours. And this happened every evening after the men had already marched several dozen kilometers on foot carrying their gear. Many of us spend enormous resources on time management, simply trying to plan our ordinary workday. We draw up fancy schedules to force ourselves to sit productively at the computer for at least 6 to 8 hours. But the Roman legionnaires had a strict natural deadline before sunset, and they met it perfectly without any planners. The price of their procrastination was not a reprimand from a superior, but severed heads in the night forest. The soldiers worked in complete, almost deathly silence, like perfectly oiled cogs in a single giant mechanism. The only sounds in the air were the centurion's terse commands and the rhythmic, dull thud of entrenching tools striking the ground. No one discussed orders, complained about blisters, or asked for a break to smoke or eat. This eerie silence frightened the barbarians more than the loudest battle cries of their own tribes. By the time deep night fell, the exhausted but satisfied army was already sleeping in complete safety behind the sturdy walls. This incredible speed of construction was their most important and powerful tactical advantage in any protracted war. The enemy simply did not have time to gather forces for a counterattack before the Romans were already sitting in an impregnable fortress. They moved slowly across the map, but each of their steps was unyielding and left no chance for a counterattack. Modern logisticians marvel at how the supply of materials was organized for this daily, massive construction project. Tools were handed out in seconds, earth was moved without delay, and stakes were driven into the ground with mathematical precision. Every legionnaire was as much a professional builder as he was a professional killer. Their hands wielded both the short gladius and the heavy wooden shovel with equal mastery. It sounds crazy, but sometimes commanders ordered the construction of a camp simply to keep the soldiers busy. Idleness was considered the main enemy of discipline, so the legions often dug trenches in completely safe provinces. This kept them in peak physical condition and prevented their muscles from forgetting the mechanics of the work. The Romans called this maintaining muscle memory thousands of years before the advent of modern sports science. Imagine the colossal endurance required of the human body for such a regimen. Waking up at dawn, breaking camp, marching through the mountains, and then digging 3 meters deep again. Their hearts and lungs adapted to these stresses, transforming their bodies into perfect biological machines. Modern marathon runners would envy the cardiovascular system possessed by an ordinary soldier of the empire. It was precisely thanks to these daily 3-hour construction shifts that Rome was able to stretch its borders across half the known world. They literally dug through all of Europe with their own hands, meter by meter, consolidating their power. The camp was not merely a staging ground, it was a physical manifestation of Roman power on foreign soil. But this power had one strange and frightening rule concerning the fate of the camp itself. In the morning, as the sun rose over the perfect city, a bugle call sounded to signal the start of a new march. The soldiers woke up, packed up their tents, and lined up on the wide streets, ready to continue their journey. But before they left, they had to do something that seemed to the barbarians like the height of absolute madness. The time had come to destroy everything they had worked so hard to build the night before. Early in the morning, the camp came to life, and the vast legion prepared to continue its long and perilous march. If the army was leaving for good and the command had no plans to return to this place, the fortress faced a grim fate. The Romans never, under any circumstances, left their completed fortifications to local hostile tribes. It was an ironclad, unbreakable rule. The enemy must never use our hard work against us. The portable wooden palisade, which the legionaries had assembled with such difficulty the day before, was methodically dismantled into its components. If it was impossible to take the stakes with them due to logistical constraints, the entire wooden wall was simply set ablaze. Huge earthen ramparts were shoveled back into the deep moat, completely and mercilessly leveling the terrain. The legion was leaving behind only black, scorched earth and an empty, lifeless forest wasteland. Just a few hours ago, this very spot had been teeming with life and had been home to a fortified mini-city. And now the wild was reclaiming its territory, erasing the physical traces of great Roman military engineering. This principle of total and methodical destruction instilled in the pursuing barbarians a real, mystical, and paralyzing terror. They arrived at the Romans' encampment and found nothing but dug-up mud and ashes. For many soldiers, the destruction of their own creation might have seemed like a psychological blow after hard labor. But the legionaries were raised to be pragmatists and fully understood the true tactical value of such an order from command. An abandoned camp could become an excellent, well-protected base for partisans or rebels in their own rear. By demolishing the walls, they deprived the enemy of cover and ensured the safety of their own supply lines. It sounds like a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie, but for the legions, it was a mundane morning routine. Destroying the camp took far less time than building it, since demolition is always easier. The soldiers worked with the same terrifying synchrony, filling in the trenches and leveling the ground under precise commands. It was the final act of their night's stay, after which the army dissolved into the morning mist. Sometimes, if the Legion planned to return here in a couple of weeks, they might leave only an earthen rampart. But the gates and wooden superstructures were always destroyed so that no one could barricade themselves inside this fortress. The Romans were masters of this land only when they stood upon it in their studded sandals. They did not believe in the durability of empty walls without a garrison, trusting only in the living shield of their soldiers. Modern military bases are also often destroyed or mined during a retreat so they do not fall into enemy hands. But the Romans did this every day, turning the process of creation and destruction into an endless, continuous cycle. This required tremendous mental fortitude, knowing that your work would literally turn to dust by dawn. But they did not dig for the sake of architectural heritage. They dug solely to survive the night. This approach made the Roman army resemble a gigantic, unstoppable natural cataclysm moving across the planet. They arrived, reshaped the landscape to suit their needs, survived, and then erased all traces of their presence. The enemy could not study their architecture, could not capture their bases, and could not use their resources. To the barbarians, they remained an elusive and terrifying force that left nothing of use behind. In the end, when the last Roman soldier left the territory of the former camp, an absolute ringing silence descended. The ground was scarred by shovels, the grass trampled by tens of thousands of feet, and charred stumps jutted out where trees once stood. It was the brutal calling card of a great empire, written in blood, sweat, and ashes on foreign soil. And this mark forever changed the course of world history. The Roman army conquered half the known world absolutely not through magic or some mythical secret superweapon. Their main secret always lay in the ordinary shovel, iron discipline, and incredible superhuman physical endurance. While other great nations relied on blind luck or the favor of the gods, the Romans built their security with their own hands. They transformed the chaotic process of survival on the battlefield into a precise, cold science that functioned flawlessly. Modern sports and military science have only recently begun to grasp the true scale of their physical achievements. What seems to us like an impossible strain was for them just another grueling shift at work. They didn't leave behind many wooden walls because they burned most of them themselves. But they left a legacy that proves perseverance and discipline can change the landscape of the entire planet. And the next time you think your work schedule is too packed or task is impossible, just remember those guys in leather sandals who marched all day and then built a city. They didn't have energy drinks, warm jackets, or comfortable mattresses, but they had a perfect system. It sounds crazy, but it was the shovel, not the sword, that actually conquered that ancient world.